What's happening, folks? It's Live Open Mike. Thank you for checking out another video. For game developers, releasing a new game is the end of a development cycle that more often than not lasts for several years. Unfortunately, they don't always go as planned. Launches like Cyberpunk 2077 will always live in gaming infamy, and VR gaming has had its fair share of shoddy new releases. In this video, we're talking about some of the worst VR game launches in recent memory. In no particular order, here's number 1. Number 1 is Altair Breaker. This co-op combat game from developer Thirdverse launched in August of 2022. Combat games typically do pretty well in VR. Games like Gorn, The Blade and Sorcery, among others, have enjoyed active fan bases for years. So what happened with this one? Well, the footage you saw at the start of this video was from another Thirdverse combat game, 2019 Swords of Gargantua. Thirdverse announced in late July 2022 that Gargantua's servers were being shut down and the game would no longer be available at the end of September. Not only that, but the game will not be delisted on Steam and Meta until the end of August, meaning gamers can still buy the game up until a month before it's shut down. The backlash of this announcement was pretty harsh and all but killed Altair Breaker's momentum before the game ever released. Thirdverse did quickly course correct and delisted Gargantua later that day, but a lot of damage was already done. Many Gargantuan fans were sounding off on social media saying they wouldn't even touch Altair Breaker. The second issue was the release's reception. Several bigger channels like Beardo Banjo, Gamertag, and VR Oasis all derided the game as being fairly boring and lacking in combat. This sentiment was echoed by fans and reviews, with the lack of maps, lackluster combat, and a strange match pairing system that lowered the enemy's power to the weakest person in your group. In short, it wasn't as good as Swords of Gargantua. Since launch, Altair Breaker has had multiple patches, expanding the content of the game, some of those as being paid add-ons. The game also recently launched on PlayStation VR 2. Not only that, but Thirdverse reversed course and relaunched Swords of Gargantua, I guess hoping to regain some goodwill with their player base. Number 2. Number 2 is Larcenauts. Overwatch is one of the most popular FPS games in the world, and Larcenauts promised to bring some of that hero shooter flavor to virtual reality. Developer Impulse Gear already had one VR hit behind them, PlayStation VR 1's Farpoint, so expectations for their next game were already high. The developers even allowed a select group of gamers to try the game in early access to get some feedback before launch, and this is where things start to go south. First off, even though the game was launching on both Steam and Meta, Impulse announced that at launch the game would only work on Rift or Quest headsets, so players using any other PCVR headset were left out in the cold. Oh boy, did this piss off the PCVR community. Their developers promised to be in later support down the line, but the response was still pretty brutal. The other thing that happened was this game suffered the perils of giving content creators unembargoed early access when the game wasn't ready for the public to see. A lot of studios will send games to creators before launch to allow them to prepare their content ahead of time, but will embargo any content from being released before a certain date, usually the day the game launches. Impulse did not do this. Creators were free to release first impressions videos, so every issue with the game was laid bare for all to see. One of the complaints about the game was the reloading mechanism. Instead of allowing the gamers to reload guns themselves like in most other VR shooters, instead you had to press a button and wait for a reload animation custom to each weapon to play. Taking control of the virtual body away from the player is basically a cardinal sin in VR. Impulse choosing style over substance in this instance left the early players unimpressed. Running in the game had a similar involuntary arm swinging motion that was also off-putting. Skill-based matchmaking was not built into the game at release either, with the developers promising to include that in a later update. So newer players knew they were going to get destroyed by hardcore fans who either were in the early betas or got the game right away and leveled up quickly. In the VR space, there are multiple content creators who have bigger communities than many game developers, so when a bad early access video comes out from one or more of these creators, the PR hit can be catastrophic. Add all of that up, and Larcenauts' official launch was more of a whimper than a roar. Early reviews of the game complained of long lobby times before being placed in matches overrun with bots, the low number of maps, and the issues I mentioned earlier. Impulse quickly patched as much as they could and admittedly improved the game a great deal, but word of mouth travels pretty quickly and the VR community was left with a general sense of apathy. Finally, number 3. Number 3, The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners Chapter 2 Retribution. Let me just say right off the bat that the title for this game is way too long. The first Saints and Sinners game is beloved by a large swath of VR fans, some calling it one of the best VR games ever made. The hype for developer Skydance's follow-up was through the roof, and just a couple of weeks before launch, the wheels came off. First, while the Quest 2 version was scheduled to launch in November 2022, the pcvr version was delayed to early 2023. Once again, the pcvr community was irate. The narrative quickly became that the Quest version was being released first, ahead of the Christmas season, as a cheap cash grab for developer Skydance. Unfortunately, Skydance didn't do much to change this narrative because the Quest 2 version at launch was a buggy mess. The chainsaw, a new weapon that was heavily featured in early marketing for the game, was completely scuffed and nearly unusable. But that's not all. Zombies would run into invisible walls while trying to chase you, some doors were invisible, the visuals during the night missions made those a pain to play. I could go on and on. I live streamed this game the day it came out and I started hitting glitches 10 minutes in. I also couldn't help but notice that despite there being years between the two games, Chapter 2's graphics were noticeably worse. The same areas from the first game looked more pixelated, with more pop-in, and the heavier use of fog to reduce draw distance. It was pretty bad. Skydance released a patch to fix many of the issues less than a week after launch, then another controversy erupted. Again, several creators already put out videos of the game, shining a bright spotlight on all of the issues before launch, so Skydance needed to get the word out about the patch and reached out to multiple creators offering to pay them to help get the word out about the patch. Sixth Off Reviews, a VR game review site, published the email on Twitter and slammed Skydance for what they deemed to be paying for good reviews. Sixth Off also questioned the integrity of any creator willing to accept that deal, and several creators pushed back on that notion. While none of this pertained to the game itself, it did add yet another dark cloud to the game in the first week of launch. And that's it. 3 botched VR game launches. I'd love to hear about your experiences with these games or any others I didn't mention. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like and consider subscribing. Thank you for watching. I'll talk to you next week.